Thank you. Um, I don't see it starting on my YouTube. That's the only thing. All right, let me try that again. Thank you. All right, so I muted the YouTube. Okay, hello,
Thank you.
everyone.
I don't see it starting on my YouTube. That's
I,
the only thing.
okay,
Let
I
me
have
try
to
that
stop
again.
this. I did
Thank
mute
you.
it.
All right, so I muted the YouTube. Okay,
All right,
hello.
I'm closing it. I'm closing it for the. Oh, there were two open. That's why. Okay, so I didn't see that. Sorry for the technical difficulties with their starting. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's event for Hispanic Heritage Month. I am Professor Mehmet Küçüközer. I'm from the Behavioral Sciences Department and chair of the Hispanic Heritage Month Committee. And so tonight we have a special event, and of course you're seeing three people here on the screen with us. So let me introduce you to also Professor Melanie Klein, because this evening is an event of collaboration with Process to Text. Professor Melanie Klein is in the English department, and Melanie, can you speak a little bit about Process to Text?
Sure. Process to Text is a reading series that was started in 2015 by myself and Anne Gorick as a place for poets to read from their work and also to talk about the process of making their work with students and other writers and anyone else who is interested in thinking about those things. And in 2018, the series was expanded by other folks who got involved, Brenda DeMartini Squires and Chanel Espaillat, and was expanded to include fiction writers and graphic novelists and so forth. So we've been going since then.
Great, great. So please, everybody who's viewing, feel free to put any comments and questions at any moment for our speaker, who I will introduce in a moment. Our special guest tonight is Deborah Paredez, and let me read her bio to you. Deborah Paredes is a scholar of ethnic studies and currently a professor at Columbia University. She has several published works in cultural topics, including an acclaimed study, Selenidad, Selena, Latinos, and the Performance of Memory. And she has also various poetry collections. And tonight she's going to read some of her selections, as well as maybe some of her essays. Um, and she, among those poetry collections are This Side of Skin and Year of the Dog. Her poetry and essays have been featured in the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, National Public Radio, Boston Review, the Georgia Review, and Feminist Studies. And tonight she's here with us, and she's a noted public intellectual as well. So, Deborah, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mehmet, and thank you, Melanie, both of you, for hosting me. It's a real joy to be here today to share my work with you all and to field questions about process, which I'm always happy to talk about. I'm going to begin by reading some poems from my 2020 book, Year of the Dog, which I which I'm happy to talk about. It was a kind of new kind of project for me, what we might call documentary poetry, which very much uses poetry as a way to engage with historical documents and archives in ways that, perhaps, existing histories haven't been able to do so in some ways. And I can talk more about that process. But the title itself, Year of the Dog, in this case refers to a couple of things. The first of it is the year of the metal dog, 1970, which was the year I was born, and was the year my father was getting ready to deploy to go to Vietnam. And so the book very much engages with a particular moment in history and the legacies of war and its afterlife as they bear upon my family, but as they bear upon many Latinx communities. Latinx communities, as well as African American communities, were disproportionately represented in that war and lost their lives at disproportionate numbers. And my father's school district, where he grew up in San Antonio, Texas, suffered the second highest number of casualties in the Vietnam War. So it was very much something that affected our lives and the lives of those around us. And the title also refers to the figure Hecuba, who very much I engage with a lot of mythic figures in the book. And Hecuba to me was very important when thinking about women and war, because as you might recall, she was the queen of Troy, and after the Trojans have lost to the Greeks, the Greeks are taking the women off to be slaves to the Greeks, and Hecuba is crying and kind of shouting out in, you know, inconsolable grief and rage, and cries and howls so much that she's transformed into a dog and leaps from the ship that she's being carried away on, and kind of lives out her life howling like a dog in the middle of the ocean. And her figure, this kind of crazy half, you know, sort of beast, you know, beyond the human kind of beast-like figure, for me really kind of represented what it means to sort of be a woman committed to, like, not refusing to be reasonable, right? Or someone who's refusing to sort of just be quiet about how horrible war is. So that's a long intro of saying kind of what themes kind of emerged for me in this book and what my preoccupations were. So I'll read a few poems and then maybe take some questions or talk a bit, maybe read a few more after that. And then if there's time, I might read something that's completely different, which would be a couple of pages from a book I'm writing about divas. So that's a whole other topic. So anyway, I'm going to start with the first poem in the book. It's called Wife's Disaster Manual. It's a villanelle, which is a form that deploys a lot of repetition. And it actually takes into account, or is about, another mythic figure, Lot's wife, right? Who we recall, the story as it goes in the Bible is that she's trying to run away. They're running away from the city that's burning, but she looks back because she's just so, she can't let go of all of her, like, material possessions. And so she looks back at the city and she's turned into a pillar of salt. And I think, well, what if she turns back because she wants to bear witness to the disaster? Wife's Disaster Manual. When the forsaken city starts to burn, after the men and children have fled, stand still, silent as prey, and slowly turn back. Behold the curse. Stay and mourn the collapsing doorways, the unbroken bread in the forsaken city starting to burn. Don't flinch. Don't join in. Resist the righteous scurry and instead stand still, silent as prey. Slowly turn your thoughts away from escape, the iron gates unlatched, the responsibilities shed. When the forsaken city starts to burn, surrender to your calling. Show concern for those who remain. Come to a dead standstill. Silent as prey, slowly turn into something essential. Learn the names of the fallen. Refuse to run ahead when the forsaken city starts to burn. Stand still and silent. Pray. Return. One of the things that I was interested in this book, in addition to the things I mentioned before, was I was really interested in how the violence of war and the legacies of those violence kind of really play themselves out and appear in the most mundane, quotidian places and events. And so I thought to myself, like, what's the most cliched and mundane form of language? And that's often the idiom, right? You know, the idiom that's sort of, you know, seems to be like, oh, language that's just, you know, so common. And so I decided to sort of play with idioms that had body parts in them as a way to kind of show body parts kind of strewn across the book and across our life, to really get at least I hope, the way violence infuses our most everyday mundane language. And so this poem is from the idiom series that appears in the book, and it's called A Show of Hands. My father taught me never to show my hand. Always play the hand you're dealt. Don't bite the hand that feeds. You gotta hand it to him. He lived his life hand to mouth, even before Nam. He knew close only counts in horseshoes, and hand grenades go hand to hand combat. Idle hands are the devil's play into the enemy's, hand it over and out of his hands. Ringing a bird in hand is worth two. In the bush, he wasn't so good with his hands. Took his life into his blood on his hands, on the one hand and on the other. As I said before, many of the poems take place in and around 1970. This next poem is actually a poem that is about an event that took place on December 4th, 1969, which was the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago by the state. When Fred Hampton was murdered, his partner at the time, Agua Najeri, who was known then as Deborah Johnson was with him in bed when he was shot to death, and she was 8.5 months pregnant. So this poem is for Deborah Johnson. It's called Lightning.
Before you continue, Deborah, could you, just for our audience, just explain who Fred Hampton was?
Absolutely. So Fred Hampton was a leader in the Black Panther Party, was very much one of the kind of rising visionary figures in the party at the time, and the FBI knew this, and so he was asleep in his bed in Chicago with his partner at the time, and the FBI and in collusion with the Chicago police shot through the apartment and killed him and murdered him. So thank you for that reminder. Lightning for Deborah Johnson. You didn't look down or back. Spent the fractured minutes studying each crease and curve of the lawmen's faces, so later you could tell how it happened, how you crossed over his body, how you kept your hands up, how you didn't reach for anything, not your opened robe, nothing. How they said, he's good and dead. How you crossed over the threshold, how you lifted one and then the other slippered foot across the ice, how you kept yourself from falling. How your bared belly bore the revolver's burrowing snout. How, when the baby starts to descend, it's called lightning, though it feels like a weight you cannot bear. Lightning is when you know it won't be long before it's over. I'll read one more poem, it's a little bit long, before taking a break, maybe, to field questions or to talk a bit more. This one is called Self-Portrait in Flesh and Stone. Before the war, my father slid shoehorns between the lips of discount loafers and socked heels. If the shoe fits, so the story goes, the true identity of the cinder-shrouded girl is known. Persephone swallowed the seeds, and her mother bent fallowed. My father's mother had 9 mouths to feed, 10 if she counted herself. Cronus ate his first 5 kids and then a stone. The memorial is cut from polished black granite and cuts into the earth. My father's name is not cut into the stone, but still I see my reflection in its surface. I tell you, it says in the book of Luke, if these remain silent, the stones would cry out. My father used to have a mouth on him, but now he reads the Bible and doesn't cuss. Soldiers in the trenches passed the time, sucking on cigarettes and the occasional fruitcake from home until their mouths clouded with rot, and they called this trench mouth. The 56th Dental Detachment Fubai Dental Clinic was the name of my father's unit. A dentist once said to Gloria Ansaldúa, we're going to have to do something about your tongue. I inherited my father's gutter mouth, which is not the same as trench mouth. Soldiers dug 25,000 miles of trenches along the Western Front. The Viet Cong required North Vietnamese villagers to dig 3 feet of the Cu Chai tunnels every day, and this is where they burrowed to escape the bombs bursting in air. I once pulled myself out of a depression by swallowing herbs and walking each day down the thin slit that cut across the winter-stripped field. Persephone pulled the narcissus from its root, and the dark mouth sucked her down. There is a photo of my father pulling a rotten tooth from the mouth of a Vietnamese boy. The trenches would flood, and the soldiers would stand for long stretches in the muck, unable to remove their wet socks and boots, and their feet would soften to rot, and they called this trench foot. I put my foot in my mouth nearly every day. Gloria Anzaldúa asks questions that are really refusals. How do you tame a wild tongue? How do you bridle and saddle it? How do you make it lie down? In a 1969 photograph by Horst Foss, a young South Vietnamese woman covers her opened mouth as she stares into a mass grave where she fears her father's body lies. Many mammals will eat the placenta of their newborns, but some Mexican women I know bury theirs near the hearth. In 1967, Dang Thi Lang sang and danced and cooked and crawled and dug with a short hoe and gave birth to her daughter in the Cu Chai tunnels. Cronus devoured his children, and still his son came back and cast him down. The soldiers would hump through the monsoon-soaked marsh until their feet bloomed with jungle rot. My father's body, and my body, and Plath's body, headstone quiet, jostled by nothing, only the mouth hole piped out, importunate cricket in a quarry of silences. That time I put my foot in my mouth and asked my father what it was like over there. My father's never eaten a pomegranate, though he has spent some time on the other side, and its shadow darkens his return. A mama bird will chew the worm and partially digest it before spitting it out into the mouth of her young, and in this way the baby bird is fed. My father, in Phu Bai, fingering the dark. I'm surprised sometimes by what comes out of my mouth, so I have to watch my tongue. Those nights, I watched my father's mouth when he dozed off in the recliner to make sure he didn't choke on his tongue during his nightly seizures. Sometimes the rot was so far advanced they had to amputate the foot to save the man. I try to swallow the truth, but still, like Cronus, it comes out of my mouth anyway. Yusuf Komanyaka returned from Vietnam and visited the memorial and wrote, "I'm stone, I'm flesh." As a defensive strategy, trenches followed a zigzag pattern and never a straight line. Back home, my father slips a hand under the lifted tongue and buffs the black leather until it shines with his reflection, and this is how he meets each week, empty shoes laid out. I can pause there for a minute before I read some more poems, and either field some questions or happy to talk more about kind of how I approach this work.
Melanie, do you have any questions you want to start with?
Sure. And Mehmet, maybe you should just mention to people how they can add a question too, and on YouTube.
Yeah, so for our viewers, to be able to put a question, you have to log on to your YouTube account to be able to ask a question or comment here. So if you weren't aware, please feel free to do that. All right, so I do have one post from Gabby Ledenko. Do a lot of your poems have influences from Greek mythology?
You know, actually, amazingly, yes. As a kid, I remember being really fascinated with Greek mythology ever since I was probably actually my daughter's age, who's now 13. And, I don't know what it was about them, except to say that around that same time, I also started writing poetry and wrote my first poems actually about my dad and Vietnam. I think precisely because it was this silence in our house, like many households in the 1970s and 80s who had either someone who returned from the war or, refugee households as well. I think the war was something that was ever present, but also a big silence. And so I think I became a poet trying to write into that silence. And so, thinking about the Greek myths, and certainly the kind of, even the Greek stories of kind of the epic hero's return, and really, I think I was interested in very much trying to complicate that, like there isn't some heroic return ultimately, I think. And I think on some intuitive level, I knew that. But I also just kind of loved that their women were sort of as much as sometimes some of them are seen to be haughty or something, sometimes just complicated, they're also just like larger than life and ferocious, and that kind of appealed to me too. Yeah, so I have in my first book of poetry, there's a whole series about Eurydice where I relocate Eurydice actually along the U.S. Mexico border, and think through what it means to think about her roaming there. So
Another comment from a student of mine, actually, Jasmine Floyd, asks, when is your favorite time to read poetry?
when is it my favorite time to read poetry? Oh my gosh. It's so funny 'cause now, as a teacher and as a mom and as, just a person living life right now, I find it's really hard to find time to read it all. But my favorite time to read it is probably actually like if I'm like at the beach and I can just have like time to myself and just like, read there, certainly, but that never happens. So usually I like to read it in the morning. So if when I'm more disciplined, I get poem a day every day. There's like something you can sign up for through the American Academy of Poets. And I try to start the day with that poem, and those days often go better for me than starting with the New York Times, which I often do too. So I recommend like just the first thing in the morning before you kind of enter into the crushing parts of your day, even just one poem. That works for me.
And that helps you, would you say that helps you confront the day?
It helps me confront the day, or it helps me just it can be really meditative sometimes, or sometimes it can be a way to feel like, oh, I have this kind of sacred moment in a day that's otherwise filled with like lots of tedium. Other people might find prayer to be that thing for them, and certainly people like my mom or my mother-in-law do that. But for me, more of a secular person that I am, poetry becomes a poem, right? Might become that way of kind of creating a kind of holy space for myself in the midst of what is otherwise, either uninspiring, lots of meetings or just difficult. I think existing in our world today is really difficult. Yeah.
More comments are coming in, just to let you know. Jasmine Floyd asks also, do you ever write sad poems in a happy tone or vice versa?
That is a great question. Have I written sad poems in a happy tone? Huh. Most of my poems are pretty sad, I guess. I do, because I write a lot about war, or the kind of after effects of violence, as you'll see in when I read one of my newer poems. But I can have a kind of wry stance sometimes, maybe not entirely humorous, although I respect people who can do that. I think this last poem that I read, I really tried to make that poem a series of just declarative sentences that didn't, them sentences themselves, not have a lot of emotion in them. So that for me was an experiment with tone to sort of say, I want to write about something that's horribly sad and hard, but I want to do it in a tone that is kind of again, more sort of declarative, almost sounding like flatline level. For me, that was a kind of new experiment. So, yeah.
And a comment from another student of mine, Kathy
Hey,
Alfonso.
you're a
I
smart
love.
student.
Thank you for the showing, students of mine. Thank you. Kathy Alfonso writes, I love how you read the poetry. I love poetry, and I'm really enjoying listening to you. So it's
Oh, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
and I just I mean I found it fascinating. What I found particularly fascinating is how you sort of draw parallels between the experiences of war, uh, often from and the experiences of people that we often overlook in war. In our case, the other side, their experiences, and also your experiences or the experiences of daily life in other contexts. The
Mhm.
parallel is fascinating to me. What led you to that? Is as you said the war was a haunting presence in your home? Was something having did it have something to do with that?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, the war was ever present, and it was ever present as a silence. And I think that for me, coming to poetry was about writing into a silence that happened. And many of us have different silences in our life, whatever those particular things are. And I think my response to it was to try to make poetry out of it, because poetry is a kind of, when you're a poet, you are, very much invested in the vicissitudes of language, but also in its relationship to silence, right? The way that we work on a page, or the way that we move from stanza to stanza, there's a lot of a kind of an investment in thinking about silence in as much as we're thinking about words. And so those things mattered for me and kept Vietnam in my present in ways that, people who talk about war, poets, whether it's Solmaz Sharif or many poets, right, long before her, talk about like the radius of war isn't just in that particular historical or geographical moment, right, but it keeps being a present tense for so many people who return from it, or who, for their families, right, who live through that with them, in whether or not it's spoken about or not. And certainly with the Vietnam War, before there was such more awareness about or acknowledgement of PTSD and its effects, that was something that I think made it really difficult, right, to address, because it wasn't spoken about so much, that legacy. And so that was part of what, I set out to write a totally different book. And I had said to myself, my first book dealt a little bit with my father in Vietnam. And I was like, I don't want to write about that anymore. And I finally had to kind of really relinquish myself and surrender myself to the fact that I may have felt done with Vietnam, but it was not done with me. It was definitely not done with me. And I think as a writer, sometimes we have to be like, you know what? I certainly don't want to write the same poem every time. I want to grow as a writer. But sometimes there are certain preoccupations or certain kind of topics that we have to continue to wrestle with, right? That aren't done with us. And I think it was really a turning point for me when I said, okay, this book, has to be written, even if I'm not wanting to re-engage.
It just seems like from the poem that you had about, of course, Lot's wife, about bearing witness, it seems like a lot of your own poetry is about bearing witness. I would say.
Yeah, that poem in many ways, I would say, if somebody had asked me, like, what poem represents my ars poetica, or what poem to me represents kind of the things that I believe in so in much of my poetry, it would be that poem. My poetry is often about the, the ethics and um, and a kind of feminist approach to what it means to bear witness. And I think a lot of the poems in this book, there's sort of concentric circles or kind of intersecting. I don't know if it's a Venn diagram. I don't know what the image would be, but this book deals with both a kind of very micro history between my father and me, right? And then it deals with kind of Latinx communities in Vietnam. But then it also deals with women in relation to war, particularly women who are bearing witness to violence and atrocities, both in that historical moment, but also across time, and both in reality and in myth. So I try to hold all those things together to kind of have time and space be kind of opening and closing, right, at the same time for me. And I think that poem tries to speak to that, in addition to just what the book is really aiming to do. And going back to your question, the earlier part of your question around trying to make those connections. Mm-hmm. So there's a poem about Deborah Johnson. There's a poem about Angela Davis. There's a poem about, women who were bearing witness to the atrocities in Vietnam in particular. There's a poem about me bearing witness to the very famous photograph by Nick Ute of Kim Phuc, who was the girl, who's often referred to as the Napalm Girl. And it's about, like, how do you look at that photo and not be complicit in the violence that is happening to her, right? So it asks questions in my attempt to bear witness to it in a series of poems in the middle of the book. How do we do that in our poetry without, again, reproducing that violence is a question that I am often concerned with.
Thank you. Still some more comments or questions. Sure. Gabby Ledenko asks, when did you decide this was the career path you wanted to take? Was there a specific turning point that made you decide this was your calling, or did you always know?
That's a great question. So I didn't know that it was a career path available to me as a seventh grader when I started writing poems. I was from a working class, Mexican American family in San Antonio. I had an amazing public school teacher who said to Julie Backey, we're still friends. She actually lives in Jersey now. But she saw that I was really interested in poetry, and she really encouraged me. I mean, she would get together with me even after I left junior high to like give me books of poems to sort of continue to support me and my she saw in me a real curiosity and dedication to writing poetry. And so at that point I knew pretty early on that I was a poet. I didn't know that this could translate to like a job, back then. And even throughout my early life, my early adulthood, I always knew I was a poet, but again, never kind of had the courage early on to say, okay, well, I'll just do that as a profession. I mean, in the United States, sadly, because of our kind of relationship to the arts, it often isn't a career path that's viable sometimes, right, in terms of financially. But I think there was a part of me that felt like, oh, well, I'm going to go be a scholar and do that, and that'll be like financial security because I'll get a job as an academic, although that's not so much the case anymore for many scholars, but it was at the time. And I think, over the course of my life, I have found I've had to recommit again and again to myself as a poet, to almost give myself permission. I mean, I've written three books of poetry. One's just in a drawer. I haven't, it's not ready to be published yet. But, I've written all these books, and I think I think by now I've really fully much like I'm thrilled that I get to be a poet in real life and, get to have a job because of that. But I think that it was something that even though I knew early on I didn't know that I could do it as a profession, and I had to keep recommitting myself to it over time. So it's never too late.
Thank you. And just one final comment so far from Gail Tronsolito. Very positive. She writes, I am really enjoying your poetry. A show of hands and lighting. So
oh, great.
Positive comments.
Thank you.
Melanie, did you want to add
Melanie,
anything before we move on?
Sure.
Just an observation about that last long poem. I really loved how there are kind of like different touchstones that reoccur all the way through. It's almost like different sets of stepping stones. And then each time one, like, mouth and tongue and my father and Kronos and Gloria Anzaldúa, and then each time they come up, they kind of reveal something new about themselves and also reflect on one another. And at the end, they kind of start to come together. The tongue becomes the tongue of the boot.
Yeah.
I thought that was really structurally amazing and beautiful.
Thank you so much.
And I noticed that a little bit in A Show of Hands too, how each time the hand comes up in a way that sounds familiar, we see it differently because it's in such a different, crazy context. And so just wanted
Thank
to
you for that. That is exactly what I was hoping for. With the idiom poems, I really wanted to, throughout this book, I wanted to take the thing that we have found to be so familiar that we take it for granted, that we're inured to it. In that case, the idiom, but also with these iconic photographs. Like in the book, you can't, if you see it, but, I deal a lot with both iconic photos, but kind of seen in new ways. I know you can't actually see, but there's a lot of images in the book.
Yeah.
Some of them are iconic photos from Vietnam, and some of them are photographs my father took, snapshots my father took in Vietnam, but also the idioms themselves, like they're, idioms, and then these photos, they're like so familiar to us, we almost don't see them or they're anymore, right? And I wanted to kind of make strange, like defamiliarize ourselves with them so that we could see in them the horror again. So in the idiom, of course, we just like one hand or on the other. Well, what happens if I put that in another arrangement that makes you see blood on those hands, right? Or whatever it is. So I think I'm happy to hear that had that effect. And then the long poem, which I don't always read because it's kind of long, but I really was someone all along who kind of moved, even though I can be a lyric poem, I kind of move narratively along this, then this, then this. And I was really trying to challenge myself to think, to sort of leap associatively across across stanzas, across lines, and to kind of have all of these different references or figures who don't usually occupy the same world find a way to kind of be brought together in a way that was surprising, right? Again, as a way of making these connections across time and space, and as a way to kind of lift up, the stories of Mexican, of Latinx communities in relation to war. I was writing this book when the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary came out, and I was like outraged by the lack of brown, and black presence in that documentary. But like it's not a story that's often lifted to the realm of the epic, right? It's not usually afforded that, and I wanted it to be like the epic tragedy. I think about a wonderful poem by Dennis Smith, I can't think of the name now, where he's like, where's our, I want cities to burn for us, like where's the burning of Troy for the boy named Troy who dies in Harlem or so, whatever it was his reference was. So I think I wanted that as well. Yeah. So I can read a few more. Should I?
Yeah, I had one more question. You made a
Yeah.
really interesting reference to Mexican women bearing placentas in
Yes.
where they live, right? Can you explain that tradition a little bit?
Sure, sure. There's a tradition. It's not just, I think, among Mexican women, but it was my point of reference, where after the placenta is delivered, the placenta, is often delivered after there's a vaginal birth after the baby. It's the sort of nutrition sack, and it's seen some cultures like make it into a shake for the mother to drink as a kind of nutritional thing. Other cultures, depending on their particular beliefs, might bury it near the house, right outside the house, as a way to bring good health and good fortune to the mother and the child. So it's sort of a kind of a folk tale in some ways, or a folk practice, I should say. Yeah.
And does it stem from pre-Christian days or?
I actually don't even know. That's a great question. I don't know. But that's going to
I
make me
know
want to
people
look
who
it
do
up.
it too. I don't know the full history
Yeah, the full
tradition
history, right?
myself, but I do know women who do it.
Yeah. Okay, I'll read a couple. Speaking of Mexican folklore, it was so funny. I was working on this book and talking about, Hecuba and grieving and all this stuff. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, well, that makes sense. With you, you're Mexican. La Llorona is like a big figure, right, for you." And I was thinking, "Oh, La Llorona isn't even in my book yet." And La Llorona, of course, is the figure in Mexican folklore who is known as the Weeping Woman, and who kind of roams the riverbanks because of her lost children, crying all night, and you can hear her. And there was always a cautionary tale told to children growing up, like, don't stay out too late. La Llorona will grab her because she's, wanting her she's lost her children, so she's going to grab you. It was a way to keep kids inside, before they're, to keep them in by curfew. But anyway, this is a sonnet called "Self Portrait with Weeping Women." I know why I fell hard for Hecuba. Shins skinned and lips split to blooming lupine on her throat's rough coat. Hurled down the whole length of disaster. I'm sure I'd grown to know by then, to slacken as a sail against the current and squall of a woman's woe. What could I do but chorus my ruddered howl to hers? When you're a brown girl raised up near the river, there's always a woman bereft and bank-wrecked, bloodied and bleating her insistent lament. Ay, Llorona. Every crossing is a tomb and a tune, a wolf wail and the moon that turns me to scratch at the tracks of every mud-dirged girl. This next poem, like I said, there are a series of poems in the book called "Year of the Dog: and then something else after it, and they take place in the Year of the Dog, and many of them in 1970. But this one, actually, towards the end of the book, takes place in 1982, another Year of the Dog, and it was the year in which the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was being built in D.C. And the opening quote, or the epigraph, is from Maya Lin, who was the designer of the Vietnam Memorial. And for those who've never seen it, it is a striking and incredibly, I think, amazing memorial. I'm not into, memorials usually glorify war, and this is one that I think does not. And it's black granite that literally just kind of cuts into the side of a hill with all of the names of every person who was documented to have been killed in Vietnam. And so Maya Lin, it was a very controversial design. She was a young Asian American student when she was selected, when her design was selected. And she said at the time, the wall dematerializes as a form and allows the name to become the object. So here we go. This is called Year of the Dog, Walls and Mirrors. The English translation of my surname is Walls, misspelled. The original S turned to its mirrored twin, the Z, the beginning of the sound for sleep. I'm nearly 12 in 1982, and the mirror is a disaster I learn to turn away from. The girl looking back, always looking to extract her pound of flesh. I had a simple impulse to cut into the earth, Maya Lin is writing, as the mirrored wall of names she's made is arranged and laid against the riven hillside. She writes, I never looked at the memorial as a wall, but as an edge to the earth, an opened side. For a wall to become a mirror, it must not absorb or scatter too much light. For a girl to become the protagonist, she must sleep with the guy, or until he kisses her awake. Sometimes we know she's the fairest one of all because of the mirror on the wall. Sometimes she must scale the city's walls to bury the guy. Antigone cuts into the earth to give him his proper memorial. She ends up the heroine and buried alive, an in-between thing, like someone who's 11 or nearly 12. When I look at the number 11, I see two walls, my name and its mirrored twin. Sometimes 11 resembles the mirrored L's at the end of wall or the beginning of llanto, the Spanish word for weeping. Sometimes 11 looks like a pair of railway sleepers arranged and laid along a track that's always leading me back to my war-worn father. Sometimes the guy comes back from battle and has seizures in his sleep, and the girl must shake him awake. Sometimes the wall and the name are one and the same. Sometimes the wall is where we end up to begin letting go our llanto. And then I'll read one more from this book, and I can take questions, and then I'll actually read a new poem. Self-portrait in the time of disaster. All morning, my daughter pleading, outside, outside. By noon, I kneel to button her coat, tie the scarf to keep her hood in place. This is her first snow, so she strains against the ritual, spooked silent, then whining, restless under each buffeting layer, uncertain how to settle into this leashing. I manage at last to tunnel her hands into mittens, and she barks and won't stop barking. Her hands to her suddenly pause. She's reduced to another state, barking all day in these restraints. For days after, she howls into her hands, the only way she knows now to tell me how she wants out. That book, my book came out in April 2020, which means it was a devastatingly difficult time certainly in New York City, but everywhere in the world. And I didn't know how much the book would kind of resonate for myself in regards to the disasters, that were happening for us. So reading that poem in 2020 was for me, even though it took place before that, was a kind of it's some things just happen serendipitously around, and also reminded me, right, like the disaster's ongoing, right? It never really fully contained in that particular moment in time, a particular moment in time. So I'll read another poem that's a new one that just as recently was online, actually published online as part of Poem a Day. I was very fortunate that the poet Erica Hunt invited me to contribute a poem when she was curating that. I'll read this and then take some more questions and then see if there's time for anything else. So this poem is another form, sort of what's called a received form. It's a sestina. And the sestina is a poem of 6 lined stanzas that the end words usually of each stanza repeat in different configurations throughout the poem. And they're usually different end words. And in this case, I chose to make them all the same end word. And so this poem takes its title from an AP News headline. Uvalde shooting highlights role of doors in security plans. The teacher remembers pulling the door closed. She thought the door would lock because that door is always supposed to lock. The door failed to lock. They say when God closes a door, the shooter will fire through the door's windows. At first, they said she left the door open and the shooter got through the door. She remembers she had opened the door to carry in supplies, propping the door open with a rock. But she closed the door when she heard the shooter just outside the doors. I ran back into the building. I still had the rock in the door, so I opened the door, kicked the rock, and then locked the door. Later, they verified she had closed the door and the door had not locked. Later, there will be a closed door inquiry at the state capitol. It's through the closed door that all the men with guns will enter. The classroom doors have windows above the knobs. The glass on one door shatters from gunfire, and a man walks through the door frame and fires more than 100 rounds. A thin blue door connects one classroom to another. He shot the door, a girl in the classroom tells the 911 dispatcher. Through the door, bullets graze 2 officers and they retreat farther from the door. No other men with guns will go near the classroom door for another 40 minutes. They said they needed the door's keys from the janitor. It remains unclear if they tried the door to see if it was locked. The girl calls again and watches the door and covers herself in her dead friend's blood, and this is how the door between heaven and hell cracks open. The doorway is a thin blue line. The men with guns unlock the door and shoot the shooter who shoots back from the closet door frame. The governor orders all the schools to check their doors each week, and all the doors everywhere come unhinged, and every door is a door, 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 is a door. So I can pause there and field more questions, and then I promise I'll end on a little bit more of an uplifting note with my next reading.
I'm just listening to you and listening to poetry. It just makes me think of the power of observation, and and also just that it's that power of observation is about living in the moment and being present, extremely present in the moment, and noting every detail of it.
I say all the time, that poetry, shares a lot with like the scientific method, with thick description and ethnography, right? That it is about a kind of a presence and attentiveness to observation to then, put into, and then our tools just happen to be language. And so then how can we use language and our observational skills to then, reveal something about the everyday or about the horrific, right? That we might not see otherwise, right? Or hear otherwise. Yeah.
I have some questions. I think that might take a little time to answer. And again, this is a little more about your background. Your Mexican American background. Could you talk a little bit about that part of your story and how that influenced the direction you took in your life, how that influenced you to become a poet? Um, just some details about that.
Sure.
And maybe also about Texas too. Right?
Yeah. So I grew up in Texas, in San Antonio, which is in sort of south central Texas, not right on the border, but certainly, kind of closer to South Texas. And I grew up in a city. San Antonio is a city that has, at the time when I grew up, it had 5 military bases and 7 Spanish missions. So all around us were signs of colonialism. All around us were signs of imperial, occupation. And we were, and it's a city. It was majority minority city, but also a city that I think really reminded, living in Texas and in San Antonio really reminded me constantly, or you were reminded constantly of the fact that you were living in a space, as Gloria Anzaldío talks about, right, which was kind of neither seemed to be important to the U.S. kind of, larger U.S. cultural kind of concept of America, nor was it seen as something that was kind of, you weren't certainly Mexican enough for the Mexican side, right? Ni de allí, ni de acá, right? This idea of like not from neither here nor there. And so it always made me, I think, aware of a kind of of having a kind of suspicious relationship to nationalism, to kind of ideas of what America meant. It also, growing up speaking Spanglish, a language that was derided by all sides, it made me very aware of language as a meaning, as a kind of marker of identity. And then how, if we paid attention close enough to language, or if we valued certain derided languages, Anzaldúa obviously teaches that, among others, it helps us really, it helped me, my formation of a poet, or it helped me become interested in language and the particular magic we can do with it, or in the particular kind of ways that we're policed by it. And so I think all those things were very central to my formation as a poet, certainly.
Um, do you still have a strong connection with Texas today?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm the only person in my family who doesn't still live in San Antonio. And so I was always the kind of the daughter who they always thought was like, oh, she was always arty and she always talked too fast to be from Texas. Sure, certainly she'll like end up somewhere else. And so, of course, I marry a New Yorker, and I, not surprisingly to anyone in my family, I end up in New York City. After living all over the country, though, I lived in Seattle for a while, and in LA, and in Chicago, and then ultimately here. So, but all my family's still there, so I see them regularly.
Would you say that the Mexican presence in Texas has changed over your lifetime, the way, Mexicans are seen in San Antonio or in Texas? It seems like San Antonio, which is sort of famous for its, obviously it's a tourist attraction, the river walk that they have there, which is, I think, speckled with a lot of Mexican restaurants. So I think Mexicanism is used to some extent as a marketing tool to bring people to San Antonio. But at the same time, I think about the with the San Antonio Spurs basketball game where they had a child who's in a
Yep.
mariachi suit singing the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, I should say, and there was a kind of backlash to that
Yeah.
too at the same time. So kind of raises an interesting question about is there are Mexicanisms, or being Mexican in San Antonio is still treated as a kind of outsider.
Sure, even though like we're nearly 70% of the population there, right? But I think that speaks to larger issues in Texas and the deep disenfranchisement that's happened along voting rights lines, along all kinds of representational lines, so that, Texas, had it not been redistricted in sort of criminal ways, is actually way more close to purple and blue than we might be led to believe. But I will say that, just like with any community, right? There are a wide range of Mexican American and Mexican immigrant communities in Texas, as well as other Latinx communities, and so that means we also run the political gamut, right? And I think sometimes what happens is some family or some communities who've been there a while will sort of try to prove their Americanness by being deeply anti-immigrant, right? And then so you have these interesting situations where some Mexican American communities might be, anti-Mexican immigrant, even though that doesn't, in my mind, make any sense, right? But there's a wide range of political representation, although San Antonio tends to be more like Austin and Houston, tends to be more of a leans a little bit more blue, I guess we could say, than not, in that regard. But yeah, and that's been such a tale as old as time, with cities kind of exploiting or kind of promoting, their sort of spicy culture as just a cultural tourist device, because tourism is still one of the biggest industries in San Antonio, which means a lot of service industry jobs, which means a lot of people not really being able to get a living wage, right? So all those things, I think, play into the San Antonio's political economy.
Mm. I don't want to monopolize all the questions. Melanie, do you have?
Yeah, thanks, Mehmet. I got one. I was interested in what you were saying about language as a means of magic, but also, being policed and controlled. And I was thinking about that in relation to the received forms that you choose to work within, the sonnet and villanelle and sestina. I wonder sort of what you feel is your relationship to those forms. Is it something liberating? Is it something to liberate?
I love it. That's such a great question. So I started writing, and that villanelle was one of the first villanelles I ever wrote because I was terrified of received forms. I'm someone who bucks against rule. I think of myself as like bucking against rules and constraints. I'm like very Sagittarian, like no, no, don't box me in. And so I started writing them just to sort of face my fear and realized, oh my God, those constraints can be, kind of both something that can be liberating, but also that I wanted to liberate given their history. But really, I learned a lot from the African American neoformalists who have done amazing work with received forms. Natasha Trethewey and Tayemba Jess in particular, and folks, Terrence Hayes and Van. I mean, there's so many. The list goes on, right? African American poets who have really taken those received forms and like broken them apart and remade them their own and invented new forms as well. Jericho Brown, and so many of them. So I learned a lot by reading and studying and spending a lot of time with African American poets, contemporary African American poets, who've approached these received forms that have historically been used to keep people like us out of poetry, right? And sort of said, no, feminists have long actually talked about this. Adrienne Rich and others have kind of talked about and engaged with received forms in this way as well, as a way to reclaim and liberate them as much as they can be a form of speaking to what we need. So yeah, I think I would say both of those things for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Speaking of African American writers, I was powerfully moved by so much of the similarities between, let's say, the work of African American writers and writers, post-colonial writers in the Middle East, for example,
Yeah.
people like Najib Mahfouz. When I read Najib Mahfouz, I thought of Richard Wright. The how they coincide so powerfully. And part, of course, is just the history of sort of marginalized or excluded populations. Um, that's a shared experience, right, for so many and when they speak about those experiences, the powerful similarities come out. I think.
It's so true. I think that you see this, oh my goodness, all over. I feel like not only in the connections we can make, right, whether it's in again in any kind of any context where we have had to engage with or been forced to reckon with colonial power, right, or occupation. I think about the connections between Palestinian poets and poets, African American poets, or Latinx poets and Irish poets, or whatever that is. I think that there's often been those kinds of resonances, and I find that poets. I was just talking to a student of mine who was. She's a Latina poet who was invited to DC for some event, and they went to visit some Irish poets, right? Because there was like, of course we would have a connection with each other. And she was like, oh yeah, I've never thought about that. And I thought, yeah, I was trained by an Irish poet, when I was in college. And not surprising to me at all, right? That in some ways there was a resonance that we both felt with one another, even if it was never spoken. Yeah.
A very important point. I think W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of the double consciousness
Double
is something
consciousness,
that's
sure.
applied to so many different contexts, globally. That that and why that Du Bois's work is so powerful.
Sure, absolutely.
I had another question about your experience because you've since once you left Texas, you've lived in other parts of the United States. Have you noticed any aspects of the Mexican experience, a Mexican American experience in other parts of the United States in comparison to Texas? Any noted differences, similarities?
Sure.
Can you speak to that?
I mean, when I was living in Chicago in the 1990s when I was in graduate school, and it was a time in the kind of demographic, sort of history or moment in that city where actually a friend of mine, Gina Perez, who writes really interesting work about Puerto Rican migration and about Latinx communities in the military, but she was she was an anthropologist at training. We were friends, and she was getting her PhD at the same time, and she taught me a lot about the communities in Chicago who there was a sizable Mexican immigrant, Mexican American community, a sizable Puerto Rican community, and how many of those communities were really forging their identities kind of in relation to one another, right? And that was very different from the context I was coming from in Texas, where it was almost overwhelmingly Mexican American. And then what does that look like when you're brushed up against another Latinx community, right? And it's not just that they were forging their identities in relation to white folks only, right? But it was very much in relation to one another. Obviously, New York City, there's such a wide range of communities, Latinx communities, although more increasingly now Dominican. And so, how that certainly shapes, one's relationship to one's own national or ethnic or even linguistic identity. In my work through having founded Canto Mundo, so Canto Mundo is an organization I helped co-found that is an organization for Latinx poets. We founded ourselves in 2009, and we held annual workshops, and we're in a kind of we're taking a break this year as we're in a leadership transition. But that space was always really fascinating for me to see how a wide range of Latinx poets from a wide range of demographic and aesthetic and cultural and linguistic kind of communities could come together and kind of lay it down a little bit and sort of really talk through the various difficulties or the particular intra-Latino struggles or biases, right? That often emerged in that space where it was just Latinx communities talking to one another. So I think that it does matter where you are. It always does. Identity is so contingent on space and relations around you. Yeah.
Interesting. I've been trying to make sense of some of the Mexican traditions that one can discover here in New York, as opposed to as I was speaking to you earlier about son jarocho music, the kind of music that I play, and I discovered it here in New York, and not when I was living in Mexico in Guadalajara, and I find it interesting because it's a musical tradition more mainly from Veracruz. But in New York, many of the Mexicans who are in New York are not from Veracruz, but yet they're playing son
Sure.
jarocho music.
I mean, I
So
think yeah.
I'm just
Right.
wondering, what is it about New York? Well, I mean, first of all, it's obviously it's a city, a metropole as they call it, right? A city that brings people from many different nations, many different regions of the world together in this one place. And perhaps when Mexicans arrive there, being in a larger context of people from so many different places, it creates a need to explore the cultural roots of their own country, perhaps more in a way, in a deeper way than they might have otherwise done if they were living in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe they explored musical traditions and from different parts of Mexico that they're not from, and discovered it and wanted to share it in some way. So it's interesting to me to think about what is it about living in a foreign country with so many other different nations, groups of different national identities, and pushes one to maybe explore further cultural roots that may not even be one's cultural roots because they come from another part of the same country.
Sure. I mean, and I think that, so many scholars have written about kind of the formation of various forms of Latinidad within that one doesn't even become, what we might think of as Latinx or Mexican American or whatever that is until they're in the space of the U.S. or the country outside of the country of origin. And that those particular configurations of whatever it means to be that, that thing, in this case, Mexican, take root in spaces, whether it's whether it's New York City or Poughkeepsie, right? Like, where we know there's a large population that either way, it will take its own particular kind of formation because you're outside of the particular regionalized context, and you're again interfacing with a wide range of communities. So that's going to inform what your Mexican looks like, Mexicanness, right, might look like. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about Poughkeepsie, a lot of people from Oaxaca, right, live in Poughkeepsie, and so they certainly celebrate their Oaxacaness, right, with the Galaguetza that they have
The Galaguetza.
every year. But it's still of the place that they're from. In New York, I'm finding like Mexicans are celebrating this son jarocho tradition, which is outside of their own cultural tradition
Sure.
from where they are from,
Sure.
which is an
I mean,
interesting
that happens.
phenomenon.
Yeah, it happens all over in LA and everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not sure when we're wrapping up, but
We have we end at 8:15.
Okay.
There's only so far one more comment, but again, a very positive complimentary comment from Gail Troncelito. She writes, Deborah Paredez, you are a natural. You're a natural at poetry. Thank you. Thank you very
Oh, thank you.
much. So
So
very nice.
great. I can read if you want. I have a very short piece that's from my book. That's not poetry, but it is related to Latinx community, certainly. So I'm writing a book of the kind of literary nonfiction about divas and why we love them, why we hate them, why what their importance has been to me over the last 50 years of my life, and their importance kind of in American culture more broadly. Within the last 50 years. And so I write about many different divas, most of them famous, but there's one diva I write about who is not famous, but I think fills a role that will perhaps be quite familiar to many folks. And this diva that I write about in this tiny, tiny little excerpt that I'll read to you is my Tia Lucia. So it's about the kind of Tia figure, the auntie figure as the diva. So I can read a little bit and then we can end on, it's a sort of brighter note to end on. Tia Lucia, prima donna. Lucia was my first. Tia Lucia Martinez Bustillo, sometimes Lucy or Lucille. To a few, Tia Chia. The accent over the I in Lucia dropped somewhere along the way, like when a diva drops her fur on the stage. Seems like all the folks of color I know have one. That influential Tia or auntie who dwell on the margins of the family, of propriety even, and who modeled a queerly singular and deliciously adorned life. Grace Jones speaks of the delightful naughtiness of her Aunt Sybil, who showed her how you could put on makeup without causing a catastrophe. Wesley Morris muses, my appreciation of what an auntie is. She does her. She's living her life. She spreads joy and love and not bitterness. She's a little grandiose, a little self-absorbed, but, you know, maybe wise and a little mystical and silly and coolly clueless, and maybe she's drunk, but that's okay. Auntie divas or proto-prima donnas who taught us to step out in style or to step out of line, who took our hand or guided it as we held the eyeliner. Tias who assured us that everything was going to be all right, or not, and who helped us craft our own sense of style as armor against the inevitable assaults. Tias who taught us how to cantilever ourselves across catastrophe, who introduced us to opera, or in my case, oysters. Tias who taught us not to fear the flesh, who made an art out of accessorizing it. Tia Lucia couldn't carry a tune or dance on point, but she could carry something off. Cat eye sunglasses, clip-on earrings the size of saucers, a Christmas sweater, unironically, someone else's money. Style was for her not simply an expression of self-possession, but of self-preservation. She refused marriage proposals and nursed black eyes from more than one lover and threw raw eggs at her sister-in-law's house and rode the bus to Vegas and back, all while keeping her black wool coat buttoned and unsullied. The same coat she wore in 1981 when she buttoned me up in my best coat and drove us downtown for the opening of the new Hyatt Regency with its glass elevators overlooking the sparkly lights of the Riverwalk that snaked through downtown, crowded with all those rich gringo guests. She showed me how to walk in like we belonged there, pretending we were hotel patrons so we could ride those elevators, rising and falling and rising again and again, looking out for once instead of in, all night long. She said to me once, in all seriousness, you know, I was thinking of hiring an orchestra and opening up my cedar chest. She opened up her chest and her closet to me. I spent many of my teenage days encased in her empire waist dresses from the 50s or her white Nehru jacket from the 60s. It was the 80s, all Bill Blass shoulder pads and Reaganomics, and I was desperate for another pattern by which to measure my life. So I aspired to fill her silhouette. The diva beckons us to become her, blurring the boundaries between identification and desire. We want her, we want to be her. She fills us with want. What I wanted was the powder blue scarf she brought back from her trip to London in 1964. Nothing particularly fancy, poly blend, pure kitsch, tourist prints of Big Ben and Buckingham Palace, but for me it was a talisman to ward off the ordinary, more than souvenir, a promise of elsewhere. The first time I folded the square cloth into a triangle and tied it around my neck, I was a 7th grader in a second-hand Jordache coat, all glasses and crooked teeth and boobs I'd yet to grow into. But the scarf, The ceremony of folding and draping and fastening, the practice d'elan. I was transformed. I don't think I took that scarf off until college, and even then, only to replace it with one secured for my own elsewhere adventures. Divas know how to accessorize. They are known by how they wear or wield their accessories. Aretha Franklin walks on stage at the Kennedy Center and tosses her clutch on the piano, lets her fur fall to the floor. Divas know that everything within or even out of reach is a potential prop meant for handling, for possession. They know all about how to inhabit a costume. For her video Perfect, Grace Jones commissioned Keith Haring to design a 60-foot wide skirt, underneath which was a lift built for her inevitable ascension. And when she rose, she took the entire floor with her, her skirt swallowing up all who worshipped her and all who did not. One of my prized possessions, my saint's relic, is one of Thea's charm bracelets, an untarnished costume piece she picked up in Vegas sometime in the 70s. One of the charms is an open-faced rectangular box that holds, and when unclasped, releases 2 miniature dice. Sometimes I roll them. Most times it's enough just to know I can. Thea called me once sometime in the 90s to say she had lost her car. I failed at first to understand. Where did you last park it? No, Debbie, I lost it to the slots. Divas risk it all, and they do it all out in public. The spectacle of their suffering is evidence of their perseverance. She was a mess, Wayne Kostenbaum writes of Maria Callas, and she was a goddess. Once Thea offered to help me sell a box of candy bars for my drama club costume fundraiser. I never saw the candy or the cash again. She carried off with it, and then carried on as usual. The diva is unrepentant. And why shouldn't she be, when caprice is her craft? She throws eggs and rides the bus when the car's been repossessed, and she does it in an impeccably broached and buttoned black wool coat. Her signature style, as easy and alarming as taking candy from a baby. Thanks.
Wow, that was awesome.
Thank you. Well, thank Thea.
Yeah.
And I think so many people from immigrant communities can relate. Particularly from immigrant
Everybody has
communities.
that auntie. That...
Oh, yeah.
So thanks so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed your work. Moving. I mean, very moving, very powerful. And forces you to reflect. Bear witness, right? So thank you again for that. I hope I'm sure our audience enjoyed it. Jasmine Floyd writes, "Thank you. I really enjoyed it."
Great. Been my pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Deborah. That was amazing.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you again, once again, for having me. It's really been a pleasure to have such an engaging conversation, and to be just having our work, just engaged at all is like a writer's dream. So it's been a real pleasure to be here.
Again, thank you. Very just a fascinating evening for us. And hopefully down the line we could do more, or maybe with some of the writers in your organization that supports
Sure. I'm happy to recommend
poets
folks
of the
that
Latinx community. So maybe we can have them,
Sure.
members of the community.
Drop me a line.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thank you again.
You're welcome.
So thank you for the evening to everyone who was part of it, everyone who shared their comments and questions. Thank you. So a couple more comments are coming in about thanking you for your work, for sharing your poetry with them. So I wanted to just remind everybody of further events for Hispanic Heritage Month. So next week, so pretty much have an event a week until our last event, which is Tuesday, October 25th. But our event next week is Thursday, October 13th, a screening of documentary shorts with director Fernando Valencia. This will be in person on campus, 12:30, 1:45 in Hudson 404. He'll share shorts of 2 documentaries that he's been working on. They're looking at about the fandango. One is entitled Fandango, looking at the culture of the fandango, a musical celebration in Veracruz. And so it's a very close look at that culture, at that tradition. That will be one of his documentaries that he's going to share. And then another is looking at maize cultivators in Jalisco and their struggles to keep that tradition alive in the face of a changing global economy. So uh, hope you can make it. It'll be interesting, especially for your film students out there who are interested in documentary filmmaking. Please join us next week, and we hope to see you there. For further events, please you can check out our events at www.sunidutchess.edu/HHM. Okay, so thank you to everyone. Thank you to Professor Melanie Klein for being here and also collaborating with us to bring brilliant writer Deborah Paredez to share the evening with us. So thank you, Melanie, for that. We hope to do more collaborations down the line.
Thank you so much, Mehmet.
Thank you. So good night to everyone. And also thank you to Patrick Huber, our media specialist, for helping us with setting up the evening and the broadcast of this program on the college's YouTube site. So thank you, Patrick Huber. So we hope to see you next week. So thank you again. Good night to everyone.
Good night.
Right.